Last week, I gave you guys the rundown of the FBI's investigation into Jane Sanders after she was accused of committing bank fraud while she was the president of Burlington College in Vermont. Now, this has been an ongoing investigation for more than a year, but the story gained national traction once the main accuser was able to implicate Bernie Sanders to this case. So, Brady Tonsing, who is a Republican operative in Vermont, is alleging that Bernie Sanders is corrupt because he used his position as a U.S. Senator to put pressure on this bank to approve the loan that Jane Sanders had applied for on behalf of the college. Now, I can't get into all of the details because I did cover this comprehensively already, but to give you a quick recap, attorney Brady Tonsing, who is the vice chairman of the Vermont Republican Party, who also served as the chair of Trump's campaign in Vermont, has been actively looking for ways to attack Bernie Sanders now for quite some time. So he actually accused Bernie Sanders of violating campaign finance laws before, but the judge in that case shot him down because the judge himself had also been the target of Tonsing's false allegations on not one, not two, but 6 different occasions. So people in Vermont don't really take Tonsing seriously because he's just a smear merchant for the Republican Party. And if he was actually concerned about corruption, then you'd think that he wouldn't have been such a vocal advocate for Donald Trump to be the president. So obviously, Brady Tonsing doesn't care about corruption, and in fact, this FBI investigation is one of the most obvious examples of a political witch hunt that I think I've ever seen. So, in fact, I would actually argue that this is a bigger political witch hunt than Benghazi. And guess who was on board with Benghazi? Also Brady Tonsing. So he just looks for ways to smear liberals, both progressive and Democrats. But nonetheless, this is something that is really important. So I think that you do need to be armed with the details so that way you know how to respond to not just Republicans, but corporate Democrats who are using this against Bernie Sanders, like Joyanne Reid. So I would advise you to watch the full video that I did last week where I broke it down and I got into all the specifics. But for now, I wanted to talk about a different component of the story, and that is Bernie Sanders. So up until recently, he's basically remained silent about this particular investigation, but he spoke out against it on CNN when Jake Tapper had asked him what he thought about it. And I thought what he said was really important, especially in light of new details that we have about the case.
I want to ask you about the FBI looking into Burlington College and a land deal there and financing around it from the time when your wife, Jane Sanders, was president of the college. You and your wife recently retained lawyers. I guess the fundamental question for you is, did you or anyone on your staff reach out to the bank to approve any loans related to this transaction?
The answer is, of course, absolutely not. And in fact, let's be clear, 5 years after my wife left Burlington College, and she left it in better shape than it had ever been in, 5 years after, guess what happened? Right in the middle of my presidential campaign, I know this will shock the viewers, the vice chairman of the Vermont Republican Party, who happened to be Donald Trump's campaign manager, raised this issue and initiated this investigation. I should also mention to you that just the other day, the person who allegedly had made this statement that I had been involved in this land deal refuted that. He said, I never said that. That was in a paper in Vermont. So, I think what you're looking at is something the Republican National Committee is very excited about. My wife is perhaps the most honest person I know. She did a great job at Burlington College. Sadly, we are in a moment where parties not only attack public officials, they have to go after wives and children. This is pathetic, and that's the way politics is in America today.
So Bernie Sanders basically told you everything you needed to know about this investigation, but he added a new detail on top of it that makes this case exponentially more ridiculous. So let me remind you that the reason why Bernie Sanders is tied to this case is because Brady Tonsing is alleging that Bernie Sanders used his position to influence the bank to approve this loan for Jane Sanders. Now, up until this point, we had no idea where this claim was coming from because he's claiming that Bernie Sanders himself or one of Bernie Sanders' staffers had put pressure on one of the bank's officials to approve this loan, but we don't know where this information is coming from. But now we actually do know where it's coming from. it's based entirely on not just hearsay, but multiple levels of hearsay. So we're talking about one person told someone, that person told another person, and so on and so forth. And it's just so ridiculous that I don't even know how to characterize this as anything other than insanity. So we now know that what Taunting is referring to as the pressure that Bernie Sanders allegedly put on the bank was a conversation that one of Bernie Sanders' staffers had with one of the bank's officials, and we don't even necessarily know that Bernie Sanders had knowledge of this conversation in the first place, but now we know that this claim altogether is bogus, namely because it's based entirely on hearsay. So the Associated Press reports a Republican lawmaker who reported independent U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders and his wife to federal officials was passing on information he heard from a GOP lawmaker who said he didn't have direct knowledge of the allegations. The lawyer, Brady Taunting, sent letters to the U.S. Attorney for Vermont and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corp, alleging that Senator Sanders pressured a bank to approve a loan to a now-closed college run by Sanders' wife. The source of that information was Republican State Representative Don Turner, the minority leader of the Vermont House. Turner told WCAX-TV that friends at the bank described pressure from Sanders' office, but he says those friends didn't have direct knowledge of the negotiations. Turner says he told Taunting about it in May of 2016, adding that he would not have brought it to the attention of federal investigators. Taunting, an attorney who served as Donald Trump's Vermont representative during last year's presidential campaign, said Monday he was standing by the allegation. So I'm going to recap what's happening here because when we put this all in perspective, it makes it that much more ridiculous. So Bernie Sanders is implicated in this investigation because of what Don Turner said. And even though Don Turner said that what he heard through the grapevine wasn't enough to take to federal investigators, Brady Taunting decided to run with it anyway, and he's sticking by it, even though Turner said that he heard about the alleged pressure Sanders put on the bank through people that heard about it. So there's multiple layers of hearsay, and this allegation is so removed from the original source that it now has no legitimacy whatsoever. And it's not like Taunting is playing dumb. He basically admitted that, yeah, this is based on hearsay, but sometimes hearsay gives federal investigators a launching point so that way they can investigate that hearsay and then acquire direct evidence. That's not really how it works. But the goal isn't actually to get Bernie and Jane Sanders convicted because everybody knows that's not going to happen. The goal is to raise doubts in the minds of voters ahead of the 2020 election, where Bernie will most likely be challenging the candidate that Taunting worked for, Donald Trump. So this is a very obvious example of a political witch hunt, but that doesn't stop political opportunists from jumping on the bandwagon because, when Hillary Clinton was being investigated by the FBI when she was running for president, that wasn't an issue to people like Joy Ann Reid, but now FBI investigations are all of a sudden a problem to her. So when you dive into the details in this specific case, Bernie Sanders is right. It is pathetic, and it's obviously a political witch hunt.
Support this podcast by joining the independent progressive media revolution today at humanistreport.com.